Hello and welcome to all of you to this webinar organized by Kashmir Institute of International Relations in collaboration with World Muslim Congress as a sideline event of the 49th session of UN Human Rights Council. Today's topic is criminalization of freedom of expression, particularly in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. As you all know, the right to freedom of expression is enshrined in the Article 19th of the United Nations Human Rights Bill, which sets out broad terms of human rights which each of us have. It was later protected by the raft of international and national treaties. Defending freedom of expression has always been the core part of the human rights organizations and human rights fraternity to hold powerful account. Right to freedom of expression underpins other human rights such as right to freedom of assembly, association, seek and receive information, to form or join societies, political parties, protest peacefully for their rights. Exercising these rights without fear and unlawful interference is central for living in an open and free society, one in which people can access justice and enjoy their human rights. However, we look in practice, governments around the globe restrict freedom of expression in one way or the other way. One of the worst case scenarios which we face is the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where this right is, with other rights, is non-extant. Restriction on free flow of information, complete ban on free and peaceful assembly, complete surveillance of print and electronic and digital media. Along with that, a complete ban on all political activities and right to dissent. We have seen over the years, this right in Indian occupied Kashmir was always at the receiving end throughout the last 33 years especially. But soon after the revocation of Article 370 and 35A, the situation has turned very horrifying in the occupied territory. As recently, we don't go to lots of communications sent by the human rights reporters to the government of India vis-a-vis this right to freedom of expression and others in communication blackout in occupied Kashmir. Most recently, Press Council of India, which is a regulatory body of government of India that visited Jammu and Kashmir, and they had a report. Despite they tried to cover up the situation through different means, but they have come with the testimonies of the journalists working in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, how they are facing the worst kind of repression at the hands of the Indian authorities. Is always the new media policy and other things. And we have seen the freedom of expression of Kashmiris is being restricted even overseas. Many of our activists, FIRs have been registered against them in occupied Kashmir, and they face the tremendous pressure while working overseas. I will quote just one, Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, who testified before this Press Council of India. Sanjay Kapoor is the editor of it was representing the innovating out of Jammu and Kashmir are quite horrifying, and it appears that Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and other state acts are being used to harass journalists and prevent them from speaking. He has also said that cutting off the internet was a deliberate act to prevent free flow of information. He would expect that the FCC should come with some recommendation on this issue. Mr. B.R. Gupta was also who also testified before this Press Council of India. He referred that cutting off the internet when Article 370 and 35A in 2019 was abrogated and Jammu and Kashmir was turned into two union territories, it was a deliberate attempt. He said that various gateways were created for journalists which proved to be hindrances for the transmission of news. The media facilitation centers offered only restrictive facilities, and it may deliberately stop the free flow of information. So these are the testimonies from the Indian journalists who are part of, who testified themselves before the Press Council of India. These are not accounts of the Kashmiri journalists who have been harassed, who have been charged with sedition laws, who have been put behind the bars, and whose media houses have been threatened if they will give any news pertaining to the human rights violation of Jammu and Kashmir. The media houses will be shut down, and they have come up with how the press club of Srinagar was closed down and was taken over by the Indian police, and how the journalists who were already allotted the government facilities, they were asked to evacuate those facilities, and how they face the reprisals each and every junction. We will discuss this and many more. And for this, first of all, I will go to, we have a very learned panel today. I have with me Ms. Mary Securi, is a Texas-based advocate for the Kashmiri Solidarity Movement, is a vocal about condemnation of human rights abuses in Kashmir. She's an American social activist and former socialist candidate for US presidency. She reports frequently on war in Kashmir, Palestine, child labor, immigration issues, and homeless, sweet shops, and human rights issues. Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think that this telecommunications lockdown going on now is almost as draconian and severe and comprehensive as it was after the August 5th, 2019 lockdown, where India took over complete colonial control of Kashmir. I think it's that severe. We know about the arrest of the human rights activists, about journalists, about the repression of any kind of protest, about the surveillance on social media. They've completely locked out Kashmiri activists from all social media. And they've also shut down communications between activists, solidarity activists, and Kashmiris outside the country, and Kashmiris. And that was previously a really vital source of information and collaboration. I think the question for us is, how do we proceed? How do we do our work of building a global solidarity movement in this context of having really no information? We do know that as they have shut out Kashmiris from social media, that the Indian propagandists have simply run wild. Aditya Raj Kaul is just euphoric because he has the floor, and there are no Kashmiris who can very cogently respond to him. So he's gone simply wild. Meanwhile, we have to conduct campaigns for the release of political prisoners, for justice for those Kashmiris, in particular the women and girls who have been sexually assaulted as a weapon of war. We have to address the issue of demanding the immediate unconditional withdrawal of Indian troops from Kashmir. But we don't know what's going on. So that's a big problem for us. So the issue is, how do we address it? Lee Rhiannon, who is a former MP from Australia and also a founder of the Let Kashmir Decide coalition, she pointed out recently that during the Vietnam War, during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, even as late as the US war against Iraq, there was no social media. We did not have that immense resource and ability to communicate with Iraqis as we did with Kashmiris. And that we have to sort of realize that even though there's a news blackout and a communications lockdown, we still have to find a way, as we did then, to build, to protest the arrest of these human rights activists. And we still have to find a way to do our work. And I think that in many ways, the propagandists are giving us opportunities. On Friday, they released the film, The Kashmir Files, and they simply are over the top pushing this propaganda film about what they call the genocide of Pandits in Kashmir in the 1990s by Pakistani-sponsored jihadis, Islamic jihadis. They've gone over the top in promoting that vision. Well, it gives us an opportunity, because the Pandit so-called genocide is one of the big propaganda tools that India uses against the Kashmiri freedom struggle. So I think we need to respond with to the Kashmir Files. I think we should boycott the film, because there's nothing to learn from propaganda trash, pornographic trash against the Kashmiri struggle. But I think we can respond with the Kunan and Pashpura Files. We can respond with the pellet gun files. We can respond with the Shopian massacre files, and all of the massacres that took place in the 1990s, when Kashmiris were allegedly on the rampage committing genocide against Kashmiri Pandits. In fact, they were on the offensive against being shot down in the streets, having their villages like Kunan Pashpura invaded, and the women subjected to rape, the men subjected to torture, and also sexual assault. So I think we need to respond and to this propaganda and use that as an opportunity, not an obstacle, to explain what really happened to the Pandits, to explain to end the confusions that people have. And I think that we should, by the time this is finished, really have elaborated for people what happened to the Pandits, so that they can no longer use that. There are other things. The Kashmiri Zone Police come on every day onto Twitter, and in one sentence explain that they are on one of their military operations in another residential area. They're hunting down terrorists, as they say. We don't have any information like we used to when we had communication with Kashmir. We don't have any information about, did they frame up, did they abduct some young Kashmiri working people? Did they execute them and then frame them up as terrorists? What happened? We don't have that, but we can continue to explain from the past, from the hundreds of military operations in the past, the formula that Indian troops use against Kashmiris. So I think we have to not let this telecommunications lockdown become an obstacle for us, but become an opportunity for us to, to explain the character of the Kashmiri struggle, and to continue to build a Kashmiri solidarity movement. My only concern is that in this lockdown, Kashmiris could become demoralized and feel once again that they're alone, that we have abandoned them because we can't get information, that no one is talking about their struggle, no one is campaigning for them. And that's my biggest concern, is that they not be demoralized. Of course, they're probably concerned that we not be demoralized, because they are, their struggle is truly an inspiration in terms of its relentless determination to be free. But I think mainly we see this lockdown as not a chance, not an obstacle, but as an opportunity. We have no alternative.
Thank you, Mary. You brought very important points that we should forge a global solidarity movement for Kashmir and turn these challenges into opportunities, this blackout challenge into opportunity. You also talked about the Kashmir files. I have just one paragraph of a Kashmiri Pandit, Kashmiri Pandit K.L. Cole, who wrote in Delhi Al-Safa on 18th of September 1990. It's not any Kashmiri Muslim, it's a Kashmiri Pandit writing on Delhi Al-Safa, Srinagar-based Delhi, on 18th of September 1990. I quote, Pandits were told that the government has a plan of killing about 1 lakh Kashmiri Muslims in order to overcome the uprising against India. They were assured that once the proposed massacre in Kashmir was completed, the moment is covered, they would be sent back to the valley. My community now understands that it was a very crude way of painting the mass uprising against India as nothing but a criminal flare-up. The Indian government tried to fool the world by depicting the uprising as a handpick of Muslim fundamentalists who had turned against the non-Muslims and had thrown them out of their homes. I know my community has lost the affection, love, respect, and goodwill of Kashmiri Muslims for having betrayed them. I feel ashamed to admit that my community has stabbed the Muslims in back. This all happened at the instance of Jagmohan. Some self-styled Pandit leaders exploited the situation and Pandits became refugees in their own land. This is Pandit K.L. Cole, a well-known Kashmiri Pandit writer who has written this on September 9, 1990, soon after this Pandit exodus from Kashmir took place. But now what we have seen, what they have painted in Kashmir files is a total, it's full of lies and incite the hate against the Kashmiri Muslims. The script of this movie, these files, is pursuing the RSS agenda, what they wanted, and the timing of releasing it in the cinemas of India was at the election time in order to have more votes in UP and others, what they did. So it's true that we have to overcome all these difficulties, these challenges. Now I will go to Barrister Tanveer Munib, a good friend of ours. Barrister Tanveer, you have the floor, please.
Thank you.
He has an election today, but still he made it.
Okay, so thank you, Altaf, for giving me this opportunity to speak before the eminent panelists. And I consider it a privilege to be able to speak on this very pressing topic, which is the criminalization of freedom of expression in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So before I basically now discuss on freedom of expression from the perspective of international law, I want to say something about this particular topic, freedom of expression itself. You know, the famous Chinese Nobel laureate Iiojk, at the time of his imprisonment, he said that freedom of expression is the basis of human rights. It's the mother of truth, and it is the basis of humanity as well. So to snatch away the freedom of speech is basically to trample on human rights, to strangle humanity, and to suppress truth. And even Indian, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, he said, the country which vigorously protects freedom of expression will never experience famine. So the freedom of expression is a fundamental human rights, as we all know, and it is very important to achieve this particular freedom of expression, so to give effect to other fundamental human rights, such as right to assembly, right to association, right to vote, and many other rights. But that's why this freedom of expression is basically international law known as meta right, so which is essential to give effect to other rights as well. So now let's get back to the perspective of international law. In international law, you see the the freedom of expression is basically a topic of public international law. And in public international law, we have few branches like international criminal law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, customary international law. But for today's discussion, I believe that if we concise this particular freedom of expression discussion within international human rights law, especially the United Nations treaty systems, that will be, I think that within the limited time we have, that will be feasible. So now let's proceed. The United Nations, you know that the first session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, on its very first session, it declared that freedom of expression is a fundamental right, and it is the touchstone for all the freedoms for which the United Nations system is consecrated. So based upon that particular declaration within the first session of the United Nations General Assembly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the Charter of Rights of the human rights all around the world, were adopted the Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it was said that every person shall have the right to freedom of opinion and expression, which includes the right to seek, the right to impart, the right to receive information and opinion in whatsoever form across any frontier. So the important thing for us to understand is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it doesn't have binding force, but some of its articles in customary international law have got that particular binding force. In a prominent case of International Court of Justice known as Barcelona Traction, Belgium versus Spain, it was decided that Article 19, which is freedom of expression in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is a part of customary international law. Now let's proceed further to the United Nations treaty system. The UDHR is a Charter of Rights. It's not a treaty of the United Nations. United Nations has 9 core human rights treaties, out of which the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, I believe Brother Altaf Hussain Wani in the beginning, he talked about the Article 19 of ICCPR, which is the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. It categorically speaks about freedom of expression in paragraph 2. This particular article has binding effect. This covenant has the binding effect, the ICCPR. India ratified it in 1979. In 1966, it was open for ratification. In 1976, it came into operation, it came into force, and India ratified this ICCPR in 1979. This ICCPR has 2 optional protocols. The first optional protocol is regarding individual complaints for the violation of the articles of the covenants to the Human Rights Committee, which is the committee that supervises the compliance of the covenants by the member states. And the second optional protocol, which was ratified, which came into force in 1979, is about abolition of death penalty, not of our concern for today. But the first optional protocol is important. Why? Because that optional protocol tells that the individuals who are subject of violation of human rights can file a complaint to the Human Rights Committee. Unfortunately, India didn't ratify that first optional protocol. So individual complaints for violation of Article 19 to the Human Rights Committee cannot be made. Now let's proceed to the Article 19 itself. If you see the paragraph 1, it talks about right to freedom of opinion. In international law, we see it differently from freedom of expression, the freedom of opinion, though they intersects and mingles with each other in some contexts. The paragraph 2 talks about the freedom of expression. Article 19, paragraph 2, along with right to information. And this is just a reiteration of the 1948 Charter of Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Article 19, this paragraph 2. So it says that, I'm repeating again, that every person shall have the right to freedom of expression, and that includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and opinion in whatsoever form, and irrespective of the frontiers. Now, this particular right comes with some restrictions, with some special rights and responsibilities. So the states, the member states of ICCPR can impose restrictions. They can never criminalize, number one. And number two is they can impose restrictions, the paragraph 3 says, but that has to be within the bounds of law. And that has to be for the protection of rights and reputation of a person, or for the protection of national security, public orders, public health, and morals. So we have to see whether the abuse of freedom of expression, whether, in the name of putting restrictions upon the Article 19, fall within these 6 exceptions given within the paragraph 9.3 of Article 19 of ICCPR. I don't think so, me personally. Now, so this is basically a general interpretation of Article 19. The Human Rights Committee, which supervises the compliance of the ICCPR by the member states, it has in 2011 published a general comment, which is very important, general comment number 34 of 2011 on the interpretation of Article 19. It is very important for anyone who wants to understand freedom of expression within the United Nations treaty system. The general comment 34. In comment number 2, in comment number 4, in comment number 11, they have categorically said, the Human Rights Committee, that the freedom of expression is basically important for the development of a human being, development of a human being as a full person. The comment number 4 says that, apart from Article 19, you have Article 17, 18, 25, and 27 that partially talks of freedom of expression. And some of the rights, for example, as I've just said, the freedom of the right to form association, right to peaceful assembly, right to vote, they have within themselves the freedom of expression, the right to information and freedom of expression integrated with those rights. And the comment number 11 says that in what could be the means of freedom of expression and what could be the means of dissemination of information and what constitutes freedom of expression. That's a whole, another chapter. I'm not going there. So in interpreting, the freedom of expression thing in individual complaints or state complaints, the Human Rights Committee on different occasions, Gossier versus Canada, Dr. Morales versus Angola, it said that the rights has to be interpreted very widely and the restrictions have to be interpreted narrowly. That has been the practice. But I believe that, the abusers of human rights, of freedom of expression around the globe, they're far away from following what the Human Rights Committee has been interpreting all through, over the periods of 3 or 4 decades in different complaints. Now let's proceed to the next thing, which is what should we do? What can the individuals or the states in question or the organizations, civil society actors like KIIR or WMC, they can do when they see there is an apparent violation of human rights, especially freedom of expression protected by Article 19. First of all, in the United Nations Human Rights Treaty system, there are 3 procedures for addressing a violation of human rights. Number 1 is individual complaints mechanism, which is not available in the case of Kashmir. The reason is India hasn't ratified the first optional protocol. Number 2 is state complaints to the Human Rights Committee, which is pretty much possible. And a state, whoever it is, it can bring the matter to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. And the procedure is mentioned within the Article 41 and 43 of the ICCPR. And the last one is inquiry procedure. Unfortunately, for ICCPR, the inquiry procedure is not available. It is available for other conventions, other human rights treaties, 3 or 4 of them. So apart from these 3, complaints mechanism, there is also another complaints mechanism, which is making direct complaint to the Human Rights Council, not the Human Rights Committee. Any individual who thinks that there is an apparent violation of freedom of expression or any rights which is enshrined within any of the human rights treaties of the United Nations, of course, that includes ICCPR and Article 19, freedom of expression, they can lodge a complaint to the Human Rights Council, because the Human Rights Council in its resolution 5/1 in 2007, they allowed so. Apart from it, an individual or a civil society actor, an NGO, international organization, whoever, they have universal periodic review and the special rapporteurs mechanism open to them, wherein they can actually submit their grievance to the given body. For example, the Universal Periodic Review, which is a special mechanism under the United Nations Human Rights Council. It receives communications from civil society actors or regional organizations, international organizations for violations of human rights of a particular body. The Universal Periodic Review reviews the compliance of human rights obligations by 193 member states, irrespective of whether that member state has ratified a particular treaty or optional protocol or not. So whenever a state is subject to review, obviously India, I believe in the next period, I think it will be subjected to review, and the state actors like AIR and WMC and whoever is interested, they can actually communicate their grievances to the Universal Periodic Review. And you have the special rapporteurs. Obviously, the special rapporteurs are independent experts without remuneration. They are appointed for 3 years. Special rapporteurs have they contact with the state in question. They can receive communication. They make report annually to the Human Rights Council, to the General Assembly. And now a matter of hope is the United Nations has a special rapporteur for protection and promotion of freedom of expression, which is, I believe, at present led by Irene Khan, the present chief of Amnesty International. So in 2021, last year, on 25th August, a communication made to the Indian government came to public, wherein the special rapporteur, expressed her grave concern about the intimidation of journalists and imprisonment of journalists as well. So, so the special rapporteurs mechanism is open. Any communication can be made to the special rapporteur, and eventually that communication will be summarized by the special rapporteur and can be put in a before the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. That will be an indirect pressure of a member state of United Nations, which is in our for our context is India. So thank you very much, Altaf, for giving me this opportunity to give a brief synopsis of freedom of expression and the protection of it in international law. It's a very wide and large topic. Had I had the opportunity to discuss further, that would have been amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barrister Tanveer. I'm very thankful to you for your time and enlightening us about the legal implications of the freedom of expression in international law and how we can use it, complaint procedures and all that. As far as we are concerned, we have been using the Human Rights Council and complaint procedures and even the special rapporteurs regularly. But when it comes to UPR processes, I have been part of the 3 UPR processes against India, and I have at all 3 times submitted a parallel report from my organization to the UPR process. But what I found in the UPR till date, it looked at that time when the council came into existence after the Commission of Human Rights, it was thought that UPR will be a better procedure to make the countries accountable or at least to improve the human rights. But what we see in last 3 cycles of UPRs, now 4 cycles now there, what we have seen that it is you scratch my back, I scratch your back. There is no condemnation of the states on anything. But as per India is concerned, during the 3rd UPR process, if I remember correctly, India got 169 recommendations from the council or the peer to improve its human rights record, and 33% of the recommendations were on the repeal of Armed Forces Special Power Act and to India to ratify the Convention Against Torture and enforce disappearances. But as we see till date, neither the government of India has ratified the Convention Against Torture nor the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances because India always says that we don't need any external advices. We have our own corrective mechanisms. When we talk of Article 19, same Indian Constitution under Article 19 guarantees the freedom of expression. But when it comes to practice, we have seen mostly in northern eastern states of India and also in Jammu and Kashmir, this is not there because most of the restrictions which are unlawful, which have been declared unlawful by the special procedures of the United Nations, time and again, they have referred to the government of India. These restrictions do not fall under the orbit of international law. But still, government of India continues with these restrictions in occupied Kashmir. We will continue to work on it and always look forward, take your advice on these and guidance how to make a powerful case of it. Thank you very much. Yeah. I will welcome Robert Fontana, who has joined us lately because he has a time misconception of time, so he joined us lately. Now I will go to Advocate Nasir Qadri. Nasir Qadri, sir, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Advocate Nasir Qadri is a human rights lawyer from Indian occupied Kashmir. He is a doctorate fellow of Law and Armed Conflict. Mr. Nasir Qadri is executive director of Legal Forum for Kashmir Victims. He has recently submitted a case through a British law firm, Snow White, against the fake encounter of a Kashmiri from Azad Kashmir, Zia Mustafa, and also a journalist in Kashmir, and human rights defender of Kashmir, Mr. Asan Untu, and he has submitted dossier also to the British authorities. Mr. Qadri, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Wani, and thank you, of course, WMC. I guess this is the second time I have been invited in the session. Last year, I believe it was the criminalization of the UAPA, the same thing, and now we are debating on this, the freedom of speech and expression. You know, as everyone know, I see the panelists, they all know about the Kashmir and the situation about the Kashmir, even the happenings, whatever happens. But now the post of 5th of August situation is concerned. If one has to see the Orwellian state, how does the Orwellian state look like? He must see the occupied Kashmir, the situation there. Or for that matter, if you read the colonialism or the French colonialism in Algeria, so one should see the similar tactics being employed by the government of India in different forms. As Mr. Wani rightly said, he started with certain rights, the positive rights under UDHR, or for that matter, the Indian system. They have their constitution, the fundamental part 3. They talk about the freedom of speech, expression, the freedom of right to form an association or assembly. They're all the positive rights, but when it comes to Kashmir, no right is available. But what is the situation? The Kashmiris live in the times of the horrors of the war, because India has waged a war against the occupied territory, which though it has been broadly, they broadcast whatever happens. Everything is available on the social media, the social networking sites, in the shape of the graphics or the insights, or we see how destructive now the conflict has become on the civilians, the main victims of the war, or every day the military operations, and they broadcast the multitude of the peoples on the move in search of the refuge. Now people are just moving out. Because I have an experience, like I used to be a lawyer there, and then something constrained us, the frustration of the local judicial system that constrained us to go outside and just see the remedy, if in case it is available. So this is Barrister the moment he has given a good presentation of the international law and the right of expression, or for that matter, he quoted a case of Barcelona traction, where definitely the right of expression has attained the jus cogens norms, or it is the customary. But again, now everything comes down to the India, whether India accept these customary principles on Kashmir? No, as rightly Wani Sahab said, neither they have ratified the CAT, nor the Enforced Disciplines TT, or for that matter, the Rome Statute, or the AP additional protocols, which safeguard certain things. But now, what is the remedy available? You know, this is not the first time that India is curtailing the freedom of speech or expression of the Kashmiris. It has now happened from last 30 years. From more than 30 years, they violate this right. And even the right under the Constitution of India, it has witnessed a drastic change right from 1961. There are Supreme Court judgments, and then up to the Indian Express case. Under the Constitution, under the so-called Constitution, the right guaranteed is a broader negative right which cannot be violated. But the Kashmir is always an exception, and it has been a test, like a test for these the draconian laws to curb these freedom of speech and expression. Post 5th of August, if I have a data available with us, with my organization, which is for this violation, freedom of right and speech, which comes the digital right violation of like the 13th, 3 days before Mr. Antonio Guterres, he tweeted about the internet rights. But again, the Kashmir is no internet is available in this few areas. But from these 5th of August till now, there has been as many as 27 reports on these banning of the digital rights, or on the journalists, curbing these journalists, or for that media persons. 107 condemnation from the global community, which includes the United Nations. More than 11 communications have been, addressed to the government of India by the special reporters, particularly on the freedom of speech and expression. And now, what India is doing, India does not. India does not care about these press release or these reports. India is drastically moving with the agenda. With the agenda, what I believe, to me as a student of law, whatever India is doing, the curbing, bringing these laws or weaponizing these things, it is, it's an alarm and alert of the genocide in Kashmir. Because India does not care about whatever India does. If we analyze or evaluate the law which they bring after the abrogation of Article 370, the media policy, it basically was to sustain their narrative, the media policy. Now, then comes the attack on the journalists, physical assault on the journalists. You see, there are stories on the archives, how they wiped out the archives, particularly, which is a testimony, how they wiped out those archives from the newspapers, or for that matter, to these online media portals. And then next comes the crackdown, the military operation, to put it correctly, a military operation on the press club, which is a shameful act. A military in the broad daylight locked down the press club of Kashmir with the help of some the parachute embedded journalists who are basically militias. So all these things now, and you see the case of the journalists, the unique case of the journalists, like Rasul Sultan, now Fahad Shah is there, very reputed journalists. They are detained under the draconian laws. And coming to this, all this, what I see is it's basically an alert. It's alert of a genocide, as already this genocide watch has already alerted about the Kashmir and some parts of the India. So, but I see curbing all those things is an alert. What would be what would be the remedy? One barrister Moomin, he rightly said that the UN mechanism is available there. Other than the UN mechanism, I believe this is the time that Kashmiris or the world, which include our organizations, that NGOs, Altaf Wani Saab's organization, or somewhere the diaspora, they should work on recognizing the war of liberation movement for the Kashmir in the broader perspective, because you cannot win the battles like this. Now, India is very adamant on this point. They don't accept your international law, because I have, as Wani Sahab also said, that they don't care. They say that their so-called domestic law, the substantive laws, are sufficient to deal the matter. But what are those substantive laws? They're basically the colonial laws. They violate the basic rights, the laws. So I have a few suggestions now. First would be working on recognizing the war of liberation movement, and then you have remedies available under international law, because whatever happens in Kashmir, it is not merely a small issue. It is basically an intense armed conflict between two nuclear states, and then local indigenous population. Then there's fighting a war of liberation, the fighting for the right to self-determination. So we have to consider on these points, and you see how India is, sustaining their narrative, the false narrative, disinformation. Like take the example of this Kashmir Files film. Why on this particular time? It is not merely the propaganda or the disinformation. It is basically an alert of the genocide. In this polarizing situation, they are just creating a problem for more these Kashmiris who are the Muslims in India, as well as for the Kashmir. So this is what I have to say. Thank you, Mr. Wani. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Qazi, for your contribution. As you rightly pointed out, each and every space of right to freedom of expression is being talked in Kashmir, be that the new media policy or crackdown on the 4.5 million Kashmiri employees. The employees are Muslim employees are at surveillance, and more than 24 employees have been disbanded from the service so far because of using the social media or sometimes praising the freedom movement or the leaders, or raising alarm on some human rights situation. And nearly 200 more employees are at threat currently. They are facing the investigations, and there is no reparation for that. You can't go to any court of law if that screening committee decides that you have violated the law and you have done this, and you can't go to any court of law for any reparation. Thank you very much, Nasir Qazi Sahab. And now I will go to Shani, a good friend of ours. She's an international strategist, political strategist. So Shani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Such a wonderful panel. Thank you very much indeed. It's an honor and pleasure to hear all your invaluable remarks. Such a great thing for me. Just would like to agree with you, and I would like to begin with the most basic definition about the freedom of expression. We would recall that this refers to the ability of an individual or the group of individuals to express their beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and emotions about different issues and free from government censorship. This is exactly how the Article 19 of the Human Rights Act, as you all highlighted as well, accepts and supports this natural right of every freeborn. As this sounds good on the book, alas, in some situations, the practice of reality might come as much different across. Like the examples we are witnessing today in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Because despite that, Indian administration is signatory to Geneva Conventions, Genocide Conventions, International Human Rights Law, and to International Millennium Declaration of the United Nations, and to many international pacts and agreements about humanity. And despite being a member of the United Nations, for some of the India's current government representatives have managed to go around these basic human rights articles and well neglected the freedom of expression. And in addition, whilst the criminal defamation laws in India are still being used to sentence the innocent human rights defenders, journalists, media representatives, NGOs, and many innocent citizens whom are simply expressing their non-criminal opinions, plus with the application of the Disturbed Areas Act, then followed by the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, we could easily realize the practice of the unfair dominance, particularly of that, criminalizing many peaceful expressions in India with especially utilized force implemented upon the residents in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. As an example, whilst also paying our tribute to all victims in the region, we could point to a recent incident on arresting the respectful Kashmiri journalists and many respectful Kashmiri journalists and human rights defenders, and our latest incidents pointing to Honorable Mr. Fahad Shah. In effect, as Human Rights Watch has also confirmed, Indian authorities arresting Mr. Shah was an act of the Indian government's crackdown on the media and civil society groups. Furthermore, according to India Press Freedom Report in 2021, at least 6 journalists were killed and 121 journalists, media representatives, and houses were targeted in India. Hence, the highest number of the journalists targeted was indeed in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, with more than 35 incidents alone. Having said so, media crime is covered by the Indian Penal Code, which is applicable to all essential aspects of the criminal law in the country. Simply today, including Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And certain restrictions on the free speech and media does really apply on the region as well. In fact, in 2020, the country's Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has even blocked their national channel, Media One TV, on temporary basis for their news coverage about the mob attacks on Muslims in New Delhi. Even more, also a few years ago, Indian government issued warning against foreign news outlets as well, with the reason for portraying the country's image negatively in the world. BBC, Time, New York Times, Al Jazeera, The Economist, The Guardian, Huffington Post, The Washington Post were amongst all these media channels, unfortunately. So now, we well agree that freedom of expression, hence freedom of media, is a fundamental human right. And surely nobody should ever be punished for protecting freedom of expression within the sound context of human rights, especially and as long as the main democratic guidelines are being followed in the coherent, non-brutal, democratic local law articles and in coherent, guiding, democratic, international law articles within a consistency. Plus, especially, as long as the act of expression does not refer to conduct, words, or other means that urge or naturally lead others to riot, violence, hate crime, or insurrection, libel, slander, obscenity, pornography, sedition, incitement, or spreading classified information, no one should be punished for standing up for peace. So this is exactly why today we have a humanitarian obligation to stand for each other as peaceful and innocent human beings, and to protect our freedom as well, the freedom of our brothers and sisters in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. We need to keep reminding to United Nations that India has committed to international human rights law, after all, and to United Nations human rights articles. So should stop breaching those whilst hiding behind her undemocratic local laws. In addition, we need to continue to demand an action from the United Nations Security Council to examine all these evident cases, war crimes, genocide, repression, shortly, the ongoing human rights abuses that keep happening in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. As a result, to achieve the victory and peace, we have to continue expressing our good intentions within solidarity, determination, coherence, and peace. Hence, thank you very much, all the valuable participants, brothers and sisters. You have highlighted an important issue, and we need to really highlight whatever the law articles India is breaching, and we need to take all these breached articles and go back to International Criminal Court and to point that India is not fulfilling her obligations. And here we are, and thank you with your guidance, and all my honor to speak with you and to act with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani, for your wonderful contribution. Now, we have a Somal documentary on freedom of expression in Kashmir, prepared by our intern, Anisa Navi. Matt, can you play that? This was a short video prepared by Anisa on the freedom of expression in Kashmir. Now I will go straight away to Robert. Robert is an author and journalist working for peace and social justice. He writes extensively about US foreign policy and Middle East with focus on Palestine. He serves on the board of Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights and Canadian for Peace and Justice in Kashmir. I think his book, which was to be available in early 22, whether it is available or not, on the settler colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. Robert will enlighten us about that too. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I'm very pleased to be here among this esteemed panel and to be learning from each of you as we talk about the situation in Kashmir and the repression of freedom of speech and other rights. Several people thus far have referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I also refer to it. Article 19 states the following: everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. On August 5th, the Indian government sought to prevent what it sees as an insurgency and made an unprecedented change to the country's constitution, as we all know. It downgraded Jammu and Kashmir from statehood to union territories. And since then, there's been a significant crackdown on political and civic freedoms in the Kashmir Valley. This has drawn the attention of the international community, but not the action of the international community. Most people will agree that free speech and freedom of expression are basic and foundational human rights. All other rights stem from them. Even the most autocratic dictators proclaim this, while working hard and often successfully to deprive their people of this right. Part 3 of the Constitution of India, dealing with fundamental rights, states that, Article 19 in that Constitution defines the right to freedom of expression. The first one, it lists 7 different rights, and the first one is freedom of speech and expression. And this is violated completely by the Indian government. A journalist Misbah Reshi, writing in September of 2020, said this, that on June 2nd, the Jammu and Kashmir administration, Indian, approved a new media policy titled Media Policy 2020, which is geared to, quote, ensure a synchronized and effective use of all forms of media to build public trust, foster a genuinely positive image of the government based on performance, and strengthen the relationship with key stakeholders, close quote. Several journalists and media houses in Kashmir protested this strongly. The Indian government's idea of building public trust includes intimidating and arresting journalists, killing them, unless they report only what India wants reported. The idea of building public trust includes shutting down independent journals and assuring that only the Indian narrative is made available to international press. One of the previous speakers mentioned how the international press has ignored the crimes that are being committed against journalists and others in Kashmir. So attempts to express opinions freely result in extremely harsh consequences for Kashmiris. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act allows for arbitrary arrest and indefinite detention of people who express opposition to the government. And of course, expressing opposition to the government is freedom of expression. The first line of the act describes it as follows: it is an act to enable certain special powers to be conferred upon members of the armed forces in disturbed areas. It also includes the statement, no prosecution, suit, or other legal proceedings shall be instituted except with the previous sanction of the central government against any person in respect to anything done or purported to be done in exercise of the powers conferred by this act. This is so broad, this opens the way for an extremely wide array of abuses which are committed on a daily basis. Researcher Haley Dushinsky wrote the following, that the legal and political realities of this act produce regimes of impunity. And given the wide parameters for state violence established by the act, security first personnel have engaged in extrajudicial killing, and they often don't need to mask their work with legal fictions because actions that may otherwise be considered human rights violations are uses rather than abuses of this act. So without accountability, there's no reduction in the amount of people who are suffering for simply expressing their opinion publicly in India. No one is held responsible for any arrests or killings or torture or anything else that they commit under the provisions of this act. So journalists, human rights defenders, and all citizens are being deprived of their freedom of speech. Holding a government accountable is crucial. In Kashmir, army and paramilitary forces have no external check on their actions under this act. And the population has very few if any, reliable mechanisms of accountability that they can call upon. And the evidence of any discipline for human rights abuses is minimal, as very few punishments have ever been meted out. Children too suffer due to repression of freedom of expression. In addition to being unable to attend school, children are killed, imprisoned, raped, tortured, and parents fear reporting these crimes because by expressing that, by doing so, they fear their own arrest. They fear that things will get worse. So this indeed indicates that the most basic expression of any opposition to the Indian government is suppressed if even parents are afraid of speaking about the abuse of their children for fear of government reprisals. Now, it's also been mentioned that UN Chief Antonio Guterres has expressed concern over these things, and he calls upon the Indian government to take preventative measures to protect children, to protect journalists and so on. But calling on the government to do this is not enough. There's so much more that must be done. Another way that freedom of expression is curtailed is medically, because of after August 5th of 2019, travel was restricted, communication and travel both greatly restricted. And this was denying people of their right to health care because it made it difficult for patients and staff to reach hospitals without being hindered. Now, following that, one doctor, a few days after the abrogation, posted a placard, and he said, "This is not a protest, this is a request." He was holding it outside a government hospital, asking that the restrictions be reduced so that people would be able to get the medical treatment they need. He was promptly arrested because of this. He simply held up a sign that said, "This is not a protest, it's a request." But it was opposite. It was opposing a government mandate, and therefore he was not allowed to say that. The number of a main area of lack of freedom of expression is lack of self-determination. We all know that there have been numerous UN resolutions pertaining to Kashmir, and one of them is Resolution 47, which calls for the holding of a plebiscite. The commitment couldn't be clearer. India agreed that the people of Kashmir had the right to decide their own future. Yet there were other provisions that explained exactly how it was to be done, what India's role was to be in that. Now, the government of India has never respected this since the resolution was passed, and its activities during that time indicates it never had any intention of doing so. And as of August 5th of 2019, any illusion that it might ever do so was completely discarded. Unfortunately, as has also been mentioned, most of the world's governments ignore the suffering of the people of Kashmir, as they also ignore India's blatant disregard for international law and human rights. So we, the people who live under different governments in the world, must act. We must continually, in unmistakable terms, let our elected officials know the horrors that India is committing, and remind our own governments, and the Indian government certainly, of their own obligations under international law. We must publicize this suffering. At present, the world is focused on the people of Ukraine, seemingly unaware that the suffering they are experiencing is not the only suffering in the world. The people of Kashmir have experienced unspeakable suffering for decades. Our role is not an easy one, but there's a moral imperative that we fulfill it. I thank you again for the opportunity of being here and for arranging this wonderful panel discussion. I have learned much, and I'm sure that the people who see it will be greatly informed. Thank you again.
Thank you, Robert, but you did not apprise us about your book.
The book, there have been some publication problems. I am hoping it will be out in the next month or so. I may make it available as an ebook on certain sites before the actual publication occurs. And I will advise you when I do so.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, because I'm eagerly looking forward
to hear about it.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Altaf and Robert, looking forward to hear about your book, and let us know so we all can have a pleasure to reading it.
Thank you very much.
Last but not the least, we have Naila Altaf Kiani. She's a broadcaster, human rights activist, and a social worker from Azad Jammu and Kashmir. Naila, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, WMC, and thank you very much, Altaf Ani Sahab, for inviting me here. It is an honor to be a part of such a wonderful panel with some of my personal favorites included as well. A lot has already been said, and I don't think I would be contributing much, but still, as a journalist, I would like to voice the concerns of my fellow journalists. As Altaf Ani Sahab has already said, journalism and freedom of expression were always difficult in Am I audible? Can you guys hear me? No. Okay.
I heard you at first and then I stopped hearing you. Was that everyone else's experience?
Naila, start over again, please. Cannot hear you. Yes, Robert, you're right.
So can you hear me now? Okay, so I was thanking WMC and Altaf Ani Sahab for inviting me here. And I was saying that it was an honor to be part of such a wonderful panel with some of my personal favorites included as well. A lot has already been said, and I don't think that I would be contributing much, but as a journalist, I would like to voice our concern, the concerns of my colleagues here. As Altaf Ani Sahab has already said, journalism and freedom of expression were always difficult in Indian occupied Kashmir. But since the erstwhile princely state has stripped off its special status by India Hindu nationalist government in 2019, things are worse than ever. And especially via the new media policy 2020, Indian government has given itself broad powers to determine whether a news is false or prejudiced against Indian national interest, although it is fascist, but it is happening. And it is obviously an attempt to wipe out the traces of any independent press. Scope for media freedom has been eroded rapidly in Jammu and Kashmir through various tactics. These tactics include cutting newspaper advertisement fundings, because these local newspapers are solely dependent on the advertisement fundings, and also by criminalizing journalists by using draconian and undemocratic laws like UAPA and PSA. Local police is also being used to interrogate and intimidate journalists over minor issues. What else? Like, I would like to mention Sajjad Gul here, because he was arrested for uploading a video of an incident. It was termed objectionable, and he was accused of spreading false narrative to provoke violence. And please be reminded here that this Kashmir file is, according to them, is not provoking any violence, and it is not a false narrative. Clearly, there are double standards. And when the court granted him bail, he was again detained under PSA, because PSA allows you a lengthy detention of more than 2 years. And again, similarly, Fahad Shah, who is editor of a web portal, Kashmir Wala, he was also detained under a clumsy case with UAPA and was granted a bail soon after it. And when he was granted a bail in 22 days, he was again arrested soon after under the same case, under another application. And again, he gets a bail for a second time, and he was detained for a third time, again for reporting the same incident under yet another FIR. And now when they were afraid that he will get yet another bail because there is no substance in the case against him, they have booked him in PSA again for the lengthy detention of 2 years or more. I have personally spoken to some of my friends, journalists in Indian Health Kashmir, and they told me that the local newspapers are erasing their work from the archives. Nasir Bhai has already mentioned it as well. Now, this is what the Kashmiri journalists have risked their lives for. They have been documenting the conflict of occupied Jammu and Kashmir for decades, and they have highlighted human atrocities, abuses by the Indian security forces there. But now Indian authorities are simply making them disappear from the digital archive. This is like twisting history, but nobody is coming to help us. Our brother reporters are not filing their stories with their bylines anymore. International organizations must do something about it. I must say here that social media giants like Facebook and Twitter are kind of helping Indian government and silencing Kashmiri voices online by removing our content, suspending and withholding our account. If we post anything to highlight Indian atrocities in Jammu and Kashmir, or if we post anything that is critical of India's military occupation and settler colonialism. For example, my own Twitter handle has been withheld for viewership in India and Indian Health Kashmir. Without pointing out any specific reason from Twitter, I did not receive any objection as well. I have written to the Twitter many times, but to no avail, obviously. Then India has blocked 2 Kashmir-related websites recently, named Kashmir Global and Kashmir Watch. They have also blocked 20 YouTube channels. This is an utter violation of right of freedom of expression. Kashmir Press Club closure, I would like to mention here, it is another blow to media freedom in Indian occupied Kashmir. Press Club was not only a learning place for the newcomers, for the new journalists, but kind of a home for us, where journalists were expressing solidarity with their colleagues who are facing utmost pressure from the government. And as a woman, I can relate how the female journalists would be feeling right now, because Press Club was perhaps the only other place apart from their houses where they could sit, work from, and file stories from without any fear. So it is nice to know that there are people out there like you who care about us. And I would like to mention here that Mary has given some wonderful suggestions here. Tanveer Muneem Sahab has mentioned a few possible avenues that can be used to help Kashmiris, but there has to be a collective effort to help Kashmiris. The world should do something before it is too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naila, for your very brief and consolidated presentation. I think at this time, I must thank all the speakers who presented their viewpoint. Along with that, at this point of time, I must commend the efforts of Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders, Mary Lola Fisher, and Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, Ms. Erin Khan, and also the Special Rapporteur on freedom of beliefs and religion, Ahmed Shahid, for raising their voices time and again on the situation of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Along with that, to all international human rights watchdogs, I think if there is nothing happening on the part of governments, as Tanvis was mentioning us about the Council, Human Rights Council, more or less Human Rights Council is totally now a political body. It has become a political body. You can't achieve anything from the council, but still we keep on knocking their conscience. But we have seen that all the special rapporteurs and all the human rights mechanisms and all human rights watchdogs around the globe have shown their concern on the situation of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, particularly after the 5th August 2019 episode, when government of India dismembered the state into 2 union territories and then enacted some laws and then trying to create a settler colonialism in Kashmir, which we hope Robert's book will cover that. And we will see how he has done all that work on Kashmir, what Indian mechanization is regarding the colonization in Kashmir. But I think all those who have been in solidarity with the people of Kashmir, we must be thankful to them. But one thing which Mary said, that it is a global solidarity, how we can put together all our efforts in order to get some meaningful results at the international level. I think it's a better time to show your solidarity by writing on Kashmir, by raising your voices on Kashmir at different panels, at different forums, and uncovering all those stories which are hidden, which the Indians won't allow the world to know. That stories ought to be told to the world, and so that the world consciousness and at least the political leadership at the global level and policymakers do have some reason to make India accountable of its crimes. And at the same time, we remind the international community of the promises made to the people of Kashmir. All this, what is happening in Kashmir, is because of those promises which were made to the people of Kashmir by the international community, that people of Kashmir will be given the right to self-determination, to decide their political future. It is this denial of this right that has led to this regime of human rights violation in occupied Kashmir. And now the Kashmiris are at exceptional threat in occupied Kashmir. But we hope the good sense will prevail at the international level and people will come to the rescue of people of Jammu and Kashmir. I thank you all once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.